Okay, welcome everybody to this field day. My name is Jack Dekkers, Iowa State University in the Department of Animal Science, and I'm one of the co-PIs of the AG2PI grants. So the Agriculture Genome-to-Phenome Initiative. I think this is our 23rd or 24th field day already. And today we are excited to have an industry panel to talk about the challenges that our stakeholders, industry, see when it comes to agriculture genomes to phenomes research challenges, but also opportunities and benefits that they see. So this is a panel discussion that's sort of a repeat, or the second version of this discussion we had at the conference we had here in September, an in-person conference. We had also 4 panel members and a lot of very good discussion and brought up a lot of very good issues. And we decided that it would be good to repeat this and make it available, make it accessible to a broader audience. So this will be recorded, just like all our field days are, and they will be on the AG2PI website. So I'll introduce the panel members. Dr. Janet Fulton, she is a molecular geneticist at Highline International, one of the largest layer poultry breeding companies. Mr. Josh White, he serves as the Senior Executive Director of Producer Education and Sustainability for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Then we have Dr. Kader Hake. He's the Vice President of Agricultural and Environmental Research at Cotton Incorporated. And then Dr. Fan Li Chu, who is the Senior Vice President for Scientific Affairs and Policy at the American Seed Trade Association. So 2 panel members from the livestock side and 2 from the plant side. So we have should have good discussion. Just like at the panel we had in September, the moderator will be Dr. David Ertl, who is the Director of Production Technology at the Iowa Corn Growers Association. And he's also been a very vital member of our AG2PI team and a member of our executive board and involved in a lot of the developments and a lot of the activities that we've put on. So I'm going to turn it over to David.
All right, thanks, Jack. You pretty much went over almost everything I was going to say, so I appreciate that. Welcome, everyone, to this second panel discussion. As Jack said, we held a live panel discussion at our meeting in September in Ames, Iowa, where we had an in-person live audience as well. And we had 4 industry panelists present to answer questions from the body that was there. And I was amazed at how much discussion we generated. We had many more questions than we had time for, and we had to cut it off. So we thought it'd be good to have a round 2 here, and hopefully we'll get the same amount of enthusiasm that we had there. So how this is going to work, I've sent the panelists 3 questions to get them warmed up and to get you thinking about some of your own questions. And what we'll do is ask you to put your question in the chat, and we'll go down through those in order as we go through these and get the responses from our panelists. If you have a specific panelist you'd like to direct it toward, please identify that, or if you want to direct it toward the plant folks or the livestock folks, you can do that. And if you have a question that's too long to type out, just put something in chat that says I have a question and raise your hand and we'll call on you. I think that's everything we need to cover. Let's get right to it. So I'll start off with these first 3 questions. The first one is, what is the position of your industry regarding transgenic traits and gene editing? So I'll just call on people in the order that I see them. Janet, let's kick it off.
Transgenics, huh? Well, currently that's not an acceptable genetic improvement method by the consumer, so we're not doing that. However, we certainly do see some value in that for future. One of the big problems in the poultry industry, the layer industry especially, is the males chicks that are hatched along with their sisters that lay the eggs and are in the commercial production houses. So currently the males are culled at hatch, and that is becoming a welfare issue in the some nations in Europe have banned that approach. There's nothing that you can use the males for, really. They don't grow very well, they don't get very big, they're very inefficient at producing meat because they've been focused for a small frame that could lay eggs for those females. But animal welfare concerns is suggesting that is going to be a problem. How do we determine the gender? Well, we can determine the gender at hatch, but that's not acceptable. The welfare people say it needs to be beforehand, pre-incubation if possible. There are some technologies that have being developed in which using GMO, where the males can be identified early in incubation. And that would certainly solve the problem of what to do with those cull males, because you can just identify and eliminate them before they hatch. But those technologies that are working require GMO. So it's kind of a, which way do you go? Is it a welfare or anti-GMO? So anyways, basically right now, GMOs are not allowed in the poultry industry.
So let's move to Josh, and maybe you can comment on what you see as the future for gene editing in animals. I know they have issues with FDA approvals.
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks for having me. So I work out of our Denver office, producer facing on education. I'm not the policy guy for this, but our policy team nominated me to do this panel. So I'll take a swing at the policy discussion at a very high level. So we are a member-driven grassroots policy organization, NCBA is. And so our members have directed us to have policy that encourages new technologies, including gene editing, that will improve health, welfare, and performance, sustainability, et cetera, of beef animals. I know that our policy strongly recommends that USDA be the governing agency instead of FDA for this. And I think they try to collaborate a bit between the two, but I'm not sure that's gone really well. And I would say that we don't agree that an animal is a drug. So that's probably about as far as I should go there. But if anyone's interested, I can dig up the actual policy language. I think you can probably find it on our website at nationalcattlemen'sbeefassociation.org. So yeah, and then what was the follow-up, David? I'm sorry, I kind of went back to Janet's.
No, I think that I was just wanting you to cover the gene editing end of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's really a challenge, and we don't have. We know some other countries are moving forward, at least with some of the knockout technology that would essentially be the same as, breeding and getting a polled animal in typically horned cattle, for instance, or some of the other simple traits that are already expressed maybe in one breed but not another, and could be achieved through crossbreeding. So in that case, we're setting ourselves up to be at a competitive disadvantage long term, in my opinion, in the global beef production and potentially pork and other industries where they're able to utilize this technology, because there's animals that are already expressing these same genes naturally. I don't know how you would tell the difference. Some of you experts on the call may have a way to do that, but For instance, I grew up raising limousine cattle, and you know, full blood, quote unquote, French limousine cattle were horned, always horned until, you know, there was one that showed up polled due to a mutation in the late 80s, early 90s. And then that developed into a polled line of, you know, through breeding up, polled line of full blood cattle. So we know that that's possible. You also could have knocked that gene out, right? And had the better quality full bloods instead of that pretty crappy polled full blood bull that showed up polled and came along with a lot of detrimental traits as far as performance, maternal, other efficiency traits. So I think there's a lot to be said for some of this technology that is more easily explained to consumers, to Janet's point, that has a positive welfare or health outcome.
Okay, so it sounds like the technology is there, just not the acceptance or approval system yet. Now, I know the crop side is a lot different. And so let's go first to Cater and talk about a specific industry that uses transgenics, and maybe you can update us on what's going on with gene editing in cotton.
Gladly. Great to be a part of this, David. Really appreciate it. And I'll hold off on talking about the details of the regulatory on the gene editing, because Fan Li is a real expert in that area. So give me a little heads up, Fan Li, on that. I'll stay away from there. But the cotton industry has unabashedly embraced GMOs from the beginning, 1995, and it's really driven by three things. One, the tremendous need with insect control. The BT technology was just so powerful. Second, we're vulnerable to weeds, and so the glyphosate tolerance was very powerful. But really the third issue was the fact that we sort of flew under the radar screen. Is some of the regulatory evaluations early on outside of the US considered a non-food crop. So some of the registrants were hoping that cotton would open the door for other crops, real food crops to follow behind. And in many cases, it hasn't. India is a good example of that. But we have biotech cotton approved in all continents except for not widely in Africa, a couple. On the gene editing, we are just as passionate about gene editing, and there's a massive investment going on in the public sector, and I presume also in the private sector. And it's really driven by two factors. One is we're a relatively small crop. So the global profitability of doing additional GMOs is just not there for the number of acres of sold seed. But probably the biggest component, what makes cotton unique, is within the genus of Gossypium. We have, I think, about 56 hobbits and elves out there, and wild weedy species that have tremendous tolerance for both abiotic and biotic stress. Many are diploids, and cotton is a tetraploid. And the scientists over the years have demonstrated that alleles can be moved around. Sometimes it takes 40 years to do it, from a weird diploid into our tetraploids. But the fact that the gene editing regulatory process is moving along, that if you could do it with traditional breeding, if it takes 40 years, a short circuit with an allele swap or a single deletion or modification might have a fast track. So we're extremely excited about what gene editing could do for cotton. And I'll leave it to Fan Li to say whether the regulatory environment's going to accept that.
Okay, so we got a lot of pressure on you, Fan Li, to
Thanks, David.
kind of give maybe an overview of the entire crop industry.
Sure. So at ASTA, just for those of you who are not familiar, we represents a broad range of crops from A to Z, alfalfa to zucchini. So many of our members has taken advantage of transgenics, right? So the cotton, corn, soy, canola, and then alfalfa folks. And I think if you look at that from, I think, a scientific perspective, it's greatly successful, right? Like they have been able to introduce resistance and protection that we cannot do in a very short time from a traditional breeding perspective. So on the science side, even from the product that's produced from these products, there's been no safety concerns, there's been no environmental concerns. So from a science perspective, there's really no reason for a more tremendous uptake. But I think from a more policy perspective, and because of the regulatory hurdles that Cater talks about, it's not just the regulatory hurdles in the US, but regulatory hurdles internationally, because all four of us, our industry is global and our customers' industry is global. We have to worry about the global regulatory space, and that global regulatory space for transgenics, both in animals and plants, is tremendous. So that definitely limits its utility to the segment of our industry that can recoup that investment and to actually wait for that investment to be recouped, because it's not just money, it's time. It takes many, many years to get all these approvals in place. And, you know, in the US, we have a lot of corporate responsibility. So we don't put things out on the market when our international trading partners are not aligned, right? So we need everybody kind of lined up before we actually put a product on the market, and that takes time. So for some of these small acreage or small business sectors, like we can't, they just know there's no resource money-wise or the time-wise to put into this. So I think for gene editing, it's really opening up a new space, right? So as Cater put it, if you look at on the research side, there is tremendous investment around the globe in research across all the different kind of crops, across all the different kind of animals. And they're looking at things that are beyond just insect resistance and weed resistance. They're looking at things that can benefit the consumer, increase nutrition, increase input use. So that's tremendous. So right now we're at the top of the innovation funnel. And what peters out at the end is dependent on a number of things. One, it's the science, of course. For, you know, people keep saying gene editing is super easy. Well, for some of the crops my members work in, it's not. They don't have transformation. They don't have tissue culture capability. So the science still need it. So the scientists around, we still need the science for that. But the policy is kind of shaking out a differently than the GMOs, right? In most countries, GMO regulation, the regulatory hurdle is really, really, really high, and it costs the crops about $30 million to go through that. So right now, if you look around the world, many, many countries are making a differentiation between GMOs and gene-edited products that could have been done through conventional breeding. So we're all scientists here. So gene editing, you can do transgenic, crossing the sexual compatibility barrier. Gene editing, you could do that. And everybody agreed that's still a GMO. But gene editing, what most people are trying to do is actually, you know, leveraging the genetic diversity within your gene, not our gene pool, but, you know, your species gene pool. And as Cater mentioned, like for cotton, that's tremendous. So countries are making that differentiation. And I think it's really interesting to see which countries are making that differentiation from a policy perspective. Japan is making that differentiation. They're full speed ahead. Certain gene edited products are not GMOs. They did 2 notification with fish and 1 with a GABA tomato, consumer driven treats. South America is all lining up. And as Josh says, some of those countries are looking at knockout animals that are heat resistant. They're also looking at soybeans and cotton and beans, things for their own domestic use. So we're seeing, it's still kind of a little bit patchworky, but we're seeing that convergence. And if you look at our 2 major markets, I think animals and plants across the board, EU and China. China is still having a little bit difficulty. They're still looking at gene editing as GMOs. And I think if you look at China's policy pivot on GMOs, right? Before they were like, we're never going to grow GM crops. Now they're going to grow GM crops. China can pivot very quickly. And if you look at R&D, they're putting a lot of money into gene editing. Europe is undergoing these 4-year, 5-year regulatory rethink about gene editing. And their rhetoric is completely different on gene editing than it is on GMOs, because they're facing food security issues, they're facing sustainability issues, they're facing all the challenges like all our growers and producers are facing. So they're rethinking that, and it'll be interesting to see how that kind of pans out in the next couple of years with EU.
All right, thanks very much. I wanted to start off with that question because at the last session we had in September, there were a lot of questions around regulatory, so maybe that will get you thinking. All right, I'm going to move on to the scripted part of this. I asked the panelists to think about how connecting genetic and phenotype information would be helpful to your industry, your breeders, and your farmers, because that's really ultimately what this whole initiative is about, is connecting genetic information with phenotypic information to allow us to be better at creating new varieties as well as helping the farmers use them. So let's see, let's start with Josh.
Sure, yeah, we could talk about this for a long time. I feel like, you know, our industry is very, it's the opposite of vertically integrated. I don't want to say disintegrated, but vast and wide flung with a lot of decision makers and a lot of different breeding objectives, I guess we would say. But I do feel like there are some trends, certainly that we're seeing, whether it's related to things like bovine respiratory disease, which is one of the largest areas that our industry as a whole loses money from a health perspective, liver abscesses, things like this that affect, you know, value, sustainability, animal welfare. We're collecting a lot more data on these areas and trying to understand the genetic components of these to make change. That's just a few examples. I guess the average farmer or rancher probably wouldn't be able to verbalize that. Our average herd size is about 40 head of cattle, so that's a weekend farmer, you know, that's doing something else full time, and then you know, to supplement their habit, and owning cattle as lifestyle and or an investment in land primarily that they run some cattle on. So I think that's important to understand about our industry. But that makes that, I guess I would describe our genetic change compared to others as very slow, but still there are thought leaders, seed stock producers, breed associations that are driving a lot of change over time. It just takes us, you know, quite a while. So I know I'm kind of going all over the place here, but I guess as an industry, we're looking into a lot of these challenges, whether it's some strategies for adaptation to an environment, or some of these health challenges I mentioned, or even as simple as better feed efficiency. And when I believe when you all solve some of these and discover what genes that we can make a meaningful selection decision around to make a difference, those will be fairly quickly for our slow moving sector adopted. I think that there are certainly a lot of leading seed stock producers that are clamoring to be able to say that they are breeding more adapted, better adapted, more sustainable, healthier livestock. So we're super excited for some solutions to come forth, and I think adoption would be quick. But I mean, I could talk about the different important traits forever. We can make improvements in basically every trait, whether it's phenotypic structure of an animal to all the production traits to adaptability and health, rumen microbiome, you know, I mean, it just goes on and on.
All right, thank you. Let's go to Janet. Keep it in the animal side for now.
Okay. So for the laying industry, our most important phenotypes are expressed only in the females. And this is the number of eggs per hen, the length of production, which can now be up to 2 years of age, persistency, which is the number of weeks where the flock will be at over 90% production. And then there's also the quality of eggs, shell strength, internal quality over that long-term period. So genetic information actually allows us to identify those males that have the best genes for those female expressed only traits. So actually a genomic selection program is based on selecting males to get improvement in the next generation of females. So we need to connect those phenotypes that are collected at the pedigree level with the phenotypes that are expressed at the commercial level. Because we have our elite lines where the selection is done, but the animals that are out there laying eggs in the production facilities are multi-line crosses and several generations away from those elite lines. So somehow we need to get connection between the elite and the production level, and that's where genetics, I think, is can help a lot. The environments management system and etc. in the elite system is very different from that in the commercial facility. So once again, if we had a genetic connection, we could do a better job of selecting for animals that have the appropriate gene combination to express well at the commercial level. Let's see. So we need to be able to connect that genotype with the phenotype through multiple generations. And there's no pedigree connection between the pure line and the commercial production bird, because it's a multi-generation expansion to get the number of birds that are needed. I think that we could get a more reliable prediction of improved individuals if we knew what the causative variants were. So we could make more progress through direct breeding or even gene editing. Okay.
David, can I jump back in real quick? I guess that
Sure.
got you thinking. Thank you, Janet, for a thought-provoking answer. I guess I'm making an assumption maybe that I shouldn't about the crowd. So just really quickly, how this is playing out today as far as genetics informing selection decisions and genetic information. You know, our purebred breeds of cattle maintain herd books. We are tracking pedigrees very heavily. And, you know, 20 years ago, we have, you know, economic breeding values, or we call them EPDs, expected progeny differences. 25 years ago, those were developed into what we call selection indexes that have an economic component as well as a genetic component. So then you can breed for maternal or terminal or various bundle of traits. So we do have primarily two commercially available genomic tests that can inform the expected progeny differences that purebred breeders are driving for to change both EPDs that are shared with their customers as well as the indexes. So there is genetic information informing, or genomic information informing those EPDs right now. And you can, each breed sort of is a little bit different, but Angus, for instance, would be the largest breed association, and they would say that the genomic information that's being derived from those breeding stock to inform an individual animal's EPDs for a young animal is equivalent to somewhere between 10 and 20 progeny already having been born and collected that phenotypic information and put back into the system from a contemporary group. So that is a great advantage, because especially with the use of embryo transfer, which most of our seed stock producers are using on their high-end stock, whether that's dairy or beef, you may have 30 sibling progeny out of a embryo flush, and then you can run that genomic data and further differentiate the best of the best, whether you're looking for bulls or females. So a lot of great genetic information, genomic information coming into those breeding decisions and that information stream already at the purebred level. There are commercially available tests for crossbred, quote unquote, what we would call commercial herds for their females. And there's almost zero uptake there. I would say on the purebred seed stock side, again, it depends on the scale and business versus hobby and all of that. Somewhere around 40 to 50% of the purebred seed stock type breeders are utilizing genomic testing on those offspring.
All right, let's hear from the plant side. I'll let you go first, Stanley. I know you represent a broad
Yeah.
range of crops, but if you have any general comments or if you want to get into maybe a few specific examples
Sure.
other than cotton, feel free.
So yes, I'll leave the cotton for Cater. But so for us, if we're, to broadly, I would say genomic informed breeding is happening already across the board, right? And when I first started at ASTA, someone said to me, like, plant breeding is not a process of selection, it's a process of elimination. So when we end up with a few varieties, we've eliminated thousands and thousands of others. So I think the more information we have from a genetic to phenome to genome kind of connection, then we limit the number of eliminations we have to do. So it's about increasing the precision of our predictable breeding, right? This is so, for all of our plant breeders, they're planning way in advance about what could potentially be necessary in the future. So the more information they have to precisely look for those characteristics, the better it works. I think the other thing for us is, our seed companies, they're selling seeds internationally, and they're then subjected to different kind of environments, and they're subjected to different management production methods, right? So, and before they put the seeds out, they're going to test them in all these different environments. So this kind of predictability, or this another layer of how genetics and impacts phenotype expression in different environments, that also helps. So we can like limit the number of field trials we're doing, and that limits our cost. So it's all about kind of, I would say, precision, predictability, decreasing the timeline from, I think Janet talked about this too, from like our breeding stock to our elite stock. And some of this, if we can use gene editing, would be fantastic. So those are the things that the more annotated the genetics can be, the genome can be, the more useful it is to our breeders. But like you say, some of our crops, our plant species have a lot of information already, soybeans and corn, but then like the berries and, the flowers, we don't have a lot of information. So, at the meeting you guys hosted in Iowa, for our members too, it'd be interesting to know what are some of the commonalities across plants that may be useful information, like the way they use water, the way they use inputs. Are there something we can draw that's at a higher level? So, the blueberry breeders can also find this information as useful as the corn breeders.
All right,
Peter.
thanks. Cater, maybe some specific examples from your crop.
Definitely, I'll give you some solid examples, because cotton, I believe, is where the other crops are going to be in 5 to 10 years. In that the group of characteristics that we have to deal with is just over the top. We have all these agronomic characteristics that the other crops deal with, plus we're a raw industrial material that feeds into an industrial chain that changes all the time. And just to give you some great examples, the US used to produce and consume its own cotton, and we had a technology called ring spinning. And all of a sudden, the German Slaughter came out with a more efficient, faster, lower cost, less labor system to produce yarn, but it needed a different fiber quality. It needed stronger fiber. So the US had to very rapidly pivot from long fiber to strong fiber to meet these new machines that were going into the US. And fortunately, we did have the genetic characteristics within our range of varieties. We were able to pivot fast. But the next change that's going to happen is to move closer to lighter weight garments, finer garments. People have heard of Egyptian cotton, which is outside of the genetic range right now of uplands. And consumers want garments that are lighter weight. And to do that, you need finer fibers. And we do not have right now have that range of characteristics within the cotton, the upland cotton genome. And so being able, but we got a lot of science trying to uncover it. and it's going to be likely, 100 genes or more. And so we're just not going to be able to do it with phenotyping like we've done in the past. We've got to move as much as possible of our criteria away from phenotyping, field phenotyping, and into lab genotyping, and because we're that raw industrial material. And I think that really opens up opportunities for other crops too. It was interesting to hear about poultry and beef cattle, how very much it is a particular poultry an industrial crop, and so you've got some very specific characteristics, not just yield that your industry has to meet. So I think and I'll add one other example as well. People that deal with cotton know that it's highly variable, and really taking up on what Fonlene was saying about the cost of conducting field trials. So cotton is a very plastic crop. It's basically a perennial shrub that we grow as an annual. And so it not only has a fair amount of genetic diversity within a variety, but it has a lot of phenotypic plasticity even within identical genotypes on that. And so as a result, we need hundreds and hundreds of field trials. A company I used to work with would not launch a variety, even though it was a small acres, unless it had 500 field trials just to make sure something didn't go south. So the cost of testing, and you add what Fonlene with the global challenge of the different production systems, we have got to move as much of the selection process to the lab, to genotyping for the cotton industry.
All right, very good. I've got one more question before we open it up, but I'd like to remind our audience to go ahead and start typing in questions in the chat that you may have, so that we'll have things ready to go after this next one. So the third question has to do with the producers. The responses we've just heard have been more focused on the breeding end of it, and some of you have touched on farmer benefit as well, but I'd really like to focus in if we could better understand the relationship of genome to phenome and the ability to predict a phenotype given the environment that we're putting it into. What would that mean for your producers? What could they do differently than they're doing now if we had that kind of information? So let's go in reverse order, starting back with you, Cater.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I want to dig into something that Fonlene was saying, and that has to do with the risk. Right now, as we all know, anyone working with agriculture, margins are outrageously tight because of input cost, and so there's just zero tolerance for mistakes, and growers are constantly making mistakes when they select varieties because of data that's poor, but also we just don't know enough about these varieties. We're changing varieties every 3 years. And so the unpredictability of some varieties, once they get out into the field, I was part of a company that yanked a variety after 1 million acres. And there were defects that were found only on that scale. So I think from a grower standpoint, the more we can help growers understand how that variety is going to perform under various conditions, and particularly not just the average, but what that range of responses is going to be. I think that's really important in risk management for growers as they make that most important decision of what seed to put in the ground.
All right, thanks. Fonlene.
Yeah, I totally agree with Cater. It's about decreasing increase the predictability and decrease the risk for our growers. And also, I think the ability to respond quickly to changing conditions too, right? And I think that component it's difficult just because we're working with living organisms, right? So, and then some of us are working with one tied behind our backs because we're not allowed to use genetics or GMOs and things like that. But I think too, it's our growers are now not just on the production side, but on the societal side, being faced with a lot of asks as well. They are asked to be more sustainable. They're asked to use less water, and sometimes they don't have a choice. They have to use less water. They have to use less inputs, and sometimes they don't have a choice because the cost of inputs is so high. So how can we, as like the input side, because I think Katie and I can say that you can, think about alternatives to other things, but there is no alternative to that seed in the ground. It's how do we make that seed as strong as possible so that, given all these other things we really have little control over, that the producers are going to get a good crop. That I think is so important. And so, we want the strongest genetics, the most reliable and resilient genetics we can put in the ground so that it can manage some of these things that are, less predictable. Well, hopefully the genetics will be more predictable, but, the prices of fertilizer right now is super unpredictable. So that's I think what our producers are going to be looking for.
Okay, we know that in crop species, genotype by environment is huge. It may or may not be quite as important in animals, but I'd be interested in hearing a little bit from the animal side on how producers manage their environment to try to minimize it, as well as some of the things that do affect it from, phenotypic predictability, incorporating the environmental effects. If you would, let's go to Josh.
Sure. Well, I guess I'm representing maybe the most hardy, resilient species in this conversation, because we expect our cows to basically stay outside and have a calf every year, raise it, and thrive in all 50 states. Some of them get brought inside some places where it gets real muddy, but for instance, in southern Colorado or the eastern plains of Colorado, even those that graze the mountains bring them down into the meadows and the valleys in the winter, and they're outside. They may be able to get behind a big row of hay bales or a windbreak, but cattle are very resilient. I think so. Continuing to breed for that adaptability to be able to withstand the various environments. Tropical adaptability is huge. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there's probably a few areas. First off, thanks to you crop genetics folks, our number one driver of sustainability is feed costs, as far as water and energy and other inputs for the beef industry. So we need you guys to keep getting more sustainable, so that we can take credit for a lower feed input imprint on the sustainability side. And you already have, so thank you. And I guess health. Health is the biggest driver, depending on the sector you're talking about, right? Those cows out on pasture and those calves are pretty darn healthy and resilient. We get a little bit of health challenge and maybe calfhood pneumonia or scours, diarrhea. Sometimes you get a little outbreak, but for the most part, those cows get the job done. The calves are healthy. Most folks do not struggle with health issues in an extensive, cattle production environment. Where we find our challenges is when we send them all to kindergarten and bring them all from all different herds around the country together in a feed yard setting or a stocker backgrounder setting to get them into that sector. So we're commingling all the kindergartners and they all come home sick, right? After the first week at kindergarten. So, we have vaccines and we do the best we can to use management tools, whether it's the, feed and acclimation strategies. But I would say, if we can solve some of those health challenges, number one, our consumer market research says that consumers cannot separate cattle health and welfare from sustainability. They think that's the same thing. So in the US, cattle welfare and health is sustainability for the beef side. So that's a huge focus. And then if you look at, for instance, feed yard data, if an animal gets pulled for an antibiotic treatment, their likelihood to grade high choice or prime, which is the steak we all want to eat, goes down like 75%. I mean, if they have a health challenge, they're not going to perform as well. They're not going to end up producing the end product we want, even if their genetics would have if they had not had that health challenge, right? They had just, whether it's affecting their lung capacity or other things, depending on what the challenge is, or if it's a or if it's a digestive issue. So they're not going to reach their full genetic potential. So I think health, when we're talking about making genetic change that would drastically impact the beef industry, I think health is where I would go, is the number one thing that a lot of producers would point to.
Very good. Now let's go to Janet. I don't suppose you bring your chickens down from the mountains every year, but you have a completely different system of a more controlled environment. But I'd still like to hear about how your producers would benefit from understanding this G by E to P relationship.
Yeah, we have a different set of challenges, yes. One of the things that we're trying to deal with right now is the changing in housing. For a long time, egg-laying birds were kept in cages that allowed for easier collection of eggs, controlled environment, less aggression, and so on. But there's a recent now change to the production of cage-free eggs, which has birds not in cages, but rather on the floor. So there's those cages that were used were small, had a small number of hens in their cages, maybe 6, 8, or 10. But now we're getting really large floor pens with thousands of birds in those pens. So now we're seeing new behavioral challenges. One of those is floor egg laying. So the birds don't find the nest boxes, they lay on the floor. And those eggs are not supposed to be sold, but you still have to pick them up to get them out of there, or you've got a mess in the house. There's far more aggression on the floor. We have more flightiness. And there's a lot of other issues such as pecking, piling, where the birds just pile up on each other and the ones underneath smother. We're seeing more keel bone damage, more bone fractures, and the birds will fall off of their perches during the night. Of course, these aren't issues on our production farms, or excuse me, our elite farms. There we have birds in individual cages because we need to collect individual record information on them. So the environments are really different. Now, some of those changes in the some of the problems with the birds on the floor can be solved by management changes. Don't know exactly what all of those are, but sometimes just walking through the house, encouraging the birds to move, teaching them to find the nest boxes, maybe modify the houses to remove the obstacles that they crash into and hurt themselves. So these behaviors can be really different, just based on management. If you don't walk the birds or teach them where the nest boxes are, they won't find them. Or if you even have poorly designed nest boxes so that the birds have a negative reaction to them, they won't use them. So as we have mentioned, phenotype is actually a combination of genetics and environment. So we've got to deal with both of them together. And we need to understand what the appropriate environment is. And if we could have a good handle on the genetics, we know that there are genetic differences in some of these behaviors. We could have a good handle on what specifically those genetic differences are. We may be able to deal with those problems and help our producers that much quicker.
All right, thank you very much. Now, for the second half of this webinar, we're going to open it up to our audience members. So keep inserting questions in, and or we're gonna have to call on people. But we do have, the first question is really more of a comment. It's about semantics of transgenics, and that implies introduction of foreign DNA. But there's other methods we use, such as cisgenics or gene editing, where there's not an introduction of foreign DNA. And we're getting into some gray areas where maybe it is, maybe it isn't transgenic, or we use transgenic processes, but we don't end up with any novel DNA left in the organism. So more of just a comment, like I said, but if any of you have any further comments on that topic, go ahead.
This is Cater with Cotton. Sorry about that, David. I'm not taking your job away from you. Sorry. Cotton. I will mention that we've actually funded the creation of cisgenic traits at Texas A&M. And we had a lot of hope that the European discussion on cisgenic versus transgenic would open up. We didn't think the US that they would recognize it, but I think that I think we need to keep that discussion alive. And I'd be curious to hear from Fan Lee whether the cisgenic opportunity, whether she has any optimism at all for cisgenic, where you would have basically a GMO that only has DNA sequences from within that genus.
Yeah, so the EU conversation is all about cisgenesis and targeted mutagenesis, right? So because they believe all type of mutagenesis is GM in their legislation, but they exempted the traditional mutagenic techniques. So this is not a science question, this is a policy question, and everybody is a legal question for some of these countries. They have a definition of GMO and they're trying to figure out how to parse it out. And there are differences in agreement about what novel genetic combination means, like is moving, swapping promoters that's within your gene pool, is that a novel combination? And I think for some, there's a lack of recognition of the genetic diversity that exists in plants, right? How messy the genome is really. So ASTA, with some of our partners, we've been really trying to have that conversation, right? Because for us, it's the recognition that all these tools we're talking about is just one tool in the toolbox, and we've been doing lots of things all over the place, and that we need to show people really the diversity of genetic variability that's occurring in our species, and how with these techniques we're just trying to mimic them or to put them together in a more production useful mechanism.
All right. The next question kind of feeds off of Cater's comment about working with Texas A&M. It has to do with how essential or important is it for your industry to work with universities or public researchers to help solve these genetic to phenotype questions. So I'll just
I'll say, I'll make a comment. We do a lot of collaborative research with the universities. The way I see it is that we each have the different things that we can put into the mix in order to be successful. And in our case, we have the large populations, the large genotype information, and with a lot of phenotypic information. When we can provide that type of data to the university, and then they can help us to answer different, what's the best way to analyze it, define different GEVs or GEBVs, whatever it is that you want to get from the data. And so if public institutions just work with their own data set, then it's not necessarily reflective of the real world. And so that's why I think it's important that industry provide that real world information and relevance to the universities. And that's where you'll get the training with the students. But as I've talked to Jack about in the past, this recent requirement of full disclosure of data being made public is going to really inhibit that whole collaborative area. There's a lot of information that we provide to collaborators that is needed in order for them to understand whatever the question is that they're answering, or understand where the data came from, how it was derived, what the limitations are. But that information is not really necessary in order to get the report published or the research published. But it's proprietary information. And so if that is going to have to be put out there into the public domain, then it's going to put a very strong crimp on those kinds of collaborations. We're in a competitive business, and so we really don't want to give a lot of our competitive secrets away.
Yeah, well, thank you, Janet, for answering that. You actually addressed Jack's follow-up question there too about data availability. So be interested to hear from any of the others on your thoughts on university and public data access of your information.
David, let me jump into that because as I've mentioned previously, we fund a massive amount of public sector research, about 300 university USDA labs. But what I want to focus on is the recent trend, really over the last 10 years, is we've seen data sharing from industry really strengthen, maybe the last 5 years, where data sharing from industry to academia, I think we're making some progress on that. We've got two specific examples. One is that we've had a massive problem with seed quality, planting seed germination, and the industry recognized that and has really come together. And some of the university research that's on the cutting edge, being told by the scientists that all three of the major companies have reached out to her and are tying into her research, hiring technicians away, funding additional research. So, you know, obviously recognizing that there needs to be maybe some pre-competitive research that they can all benefit from. The other example I'll share is we just recently had our big tour for breeders and plant pathologists. And I was so pleased with the willingness of the industry partners to share and engage. You know, 10 years ago on some of those tours, industry people would drive around in a separate car. So they would have opportunities to engage on the bus with the university or competitors. But this last tour was just over the top good at the engagement. So I think the data sharing is always gone from the university to industry, either as employees or publications. But I think just recently we were seeing some movement in the other direction, primarily in that pre-competitive space.
Yeah, I guess from the producer perspective, it's very interesting working for the national organization. I worked for a state organization before, and there was quite a bit of collaboration regionally. But we hear quite a lot when producers are investing, for instance, checkoff dollars in research. They're really interested in making sure no one else is duplicating that research. Of course, that's violating the basics of the scientific research principles, the scientific principles that you need to validate research, right? So we have to kind of explain that to them. But I think there are so many great examples in the cattle industry of collaboration, both between, for instance, the USDA Meat Animal Research Center. You know, the cows on that center, a lot of them are owned by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and there's tremendous partnership because that's located in Nebraska. And I've seen the same thing in other states where there's tremendous collaboration between the land-grant university and the USDA research centers that are in their neighborhood. And we're seeing more even across more of a systems approach. I see this regenerative question floating in here and more looking at more of a systems approach with crops and livestock. We're seeing that even within the collaboration among some of the research entities within USDA, sharing more information. You know, maybe Meat Animal Research Center hasn't traditionally done research around the range science, but could they allow some folks to come onto their facility to utilize some of their extensive record keeping just from cow productivity and pastures and start looking at the pasture and range side of things. So I think it's essential from the producer perspective that we collaborate with limited research dollars. There's not more dollars coming. The dollars buying powers eroding rapidly. And so we have to make the best use of it. And then I would also say there was previously conversation around how competitive things were. There's a lot of pre-competitive space in the beef cattle side. A lot of willingness, especially when you get to talk about farmers and ranchers and what they want to see out of USDA and our land grants and what we're driving toward. I already mentioned cattle health and welfare. A lot of pre-competitive space there, and in food safety and other areas. So a lot of the sustainability narrative is tending to drive to a bit of or lean into more pre-competitive. For instance, when you have an end user like Walmart or McDonald's wanting to drive change, I could see them buying a product that would be fed to all the cattle to reduce methane. So that all of a sudden, I guess there may be a winner that McDonald's buys from, but as far as the rest of the industry, it becomes just something that we do as an industry to lower methane production in the cow herd. So there's a lot of collaboration going, and again, I mentioned earlier how disintegrated we are as an industry. To illustrate that, our largest cow owner, it would be Deseret Ranches, and they have a little over 100,000 cows out of over 30 million cow herd. So, and then it falls off rapidly. So 1/3 of 1% of the cows controlled by one entity. And after that, it falls off a cliff. As far as the top 10 owners of cows, you get to half of that at the next dip, and then half of that again pretty quick. So the cows are all over the place. If you were to ask a packer like Tyson or Cargill, why don't you just, mash this thing together so there's less decision makers? They'll say, no, we're the opposite. We want more folks raising cattle because the cow herd is down. There's challenges with having enough cows in the herd. So they want everyone that's willing to run 20 or 30 head out there to do it so that they have enough cattle to kill next year.
Okay, I'd like to jump down to Pat's question because it's kind of a follow-up. He mentions that there seems to be a lot more cooperation between industry and academics in the livestock sector regarding genetic and phenotypic data, and not so much on the crop side. I don't know if either you, Janet, or Josh, have any idea why that is or how it came to be.
Well, for our side, I would say the Beef Improvement Federation, beefimprovement.org, if you want to look at that. They've set the tone, and that was a group of breeders and breed associations, in the late 70s, maybe even late 60s, early 70s, came together and said, how can we drive change in such a vast organization? And so a lot of folks came together and started sharing information, and it was producer driven from several leading seed stock voices and breed associations. And so breed associations, producers, and the commercial, whether it's semen providers or genomics product providers, they all come together once a year and collaborate. And that's been going on, that's a deep tradition now, many, many years. I guess the other piece, it's not as big a business. Maybe there's not as many dollars at stake. So a lot of these companies that are providing genomic services, it's a very small part of their overall portfolio. It's not the key driver of their business success. So maybe that enables them to be under a little less pressure as part of their organization to deliver, to the bottom line as intensely.
So in Janet and poultry, is there this kind of collaboration that you see in dairy and beef as well?
From my perspective, I always thought that there was a lot more collaboration in the beef, than dairy industry. There's a lot more government supported breeding programs in the beef and dairy industry, including the organization that would even track production information. There's the USDA funds into producing chips that are available for in the public domain. There's nothing like that for poultry. We have our own chips that we paid for and developed ourselves. We have to pay for independent test facilities to give us phenotypic information between different lines. I would make a comment that the layer breeding industry is actually pretty small. We have 5 geneticists, and we are responsible for genetics that is 50% of the world egg production from 5 people. We can't know everything about everything, so it's very helpful to be able to collaborate with industry or academics that may have a different perspective on some things. Now, I can't really say why the crop industry does less than this. I just don't know enough about them to be able to answer that question.
Well, it sounds like we have way too many breeders, maybe. If we only had 5, maybe there'd be more cooperation. I'm going to move on. There's a couple questions related to sustainability now, and one has to do with leveraging agricultural systems for carbon removal, and I think this is probably more focused on the crop side, but I know there's other things that the livestock industry is doing in terms of carbon avoidance, perhaps. I'd like to let's hear first from the crop side on things that are going on with, attempts to modify the carbon sequestration aspect with crops, and then we'll move to the animal side to see what you're doing. So, Fan Lee, you want to take a shot at it?
I can start. Cater will have some stuff to add. There are things going on to kind of increase the root structure of plants, right? To really, I think, targeting carbon sequestration. But the one that I know of is actually coming out of UC San Francisco. They're really looking at root structure to see whether it can capture carbon better, but they're using transgenic technologies, right? So I think we're at this, there's a little bit of an inflection point here, where is it GMO bad or is carbon bad? Like, which one's worse? And people's got to start making choices, because if you want something to happen quickly, then we got to use everything that we got in our toolbox. But I think too is this not just about what you're planting, but when you plant and how you cover the soil, right? So just that is also a discussion that's received actually a lot of congressional attention. And the seed industry is trying to figure out how to meet that demand now for cover crops and things like that. And that too is like, you can't turn on a dime for us, right? Like there was no demand before, and all of a sudden you want all of these cover crops, and we have no idea what the interaction of these cover crops in certain regions are, or how to interplay with the other cropping system, like all this stuff and we don't want to do things that could potentially damage the reputation of, right? So everyone thinks it's a great idea, and if it's not implemented correctly, then all of a sudden it's not a great idea anymore. But it is still a great idea. We just have to think about how to implement it in a smart way. So those are a couple of things that I think on the carbon sequestration side that the crop industry is focusing on. But Cater may have more.
I'll just add to what Lee was saying. Probably the most exciting, but I think out there, carbon sequestration is Joanna Corey's, and I'm slaughtering her last name, but at the Salk Institute. And she's got massive amount of funding to increase the superin content of roots. It's just extremely innovative. Obviously, as finally these things are transgenic, but could be really transformative, in my opinion. Stepping back from that really major objective. And I'd be curious, David, is corn engaged in that that superin research at all? But I think there's quite a bit of work. I know there is within cotton, and I look a little bit at some of the other crops like wheat, at looking at the root architecture. The Australians are really advanced in root architecture and trying to have roots that would sequester more carbon and at the same time help address some of the the climate change resiliency issue. But probably the biggest role that's being played is the one that Fan Li mentioned, is that it's cultural practices. And with the $1.8, $1.9 billion of climate smart agriculture, I really think we're just going to be supercharged in terms of allowing growers to try, whether it's cover crops, no-till, other production practices, some innovative rotations with perennials, or allowing growers to try some of those things without risking a 100-acre field and a massive financial loss. So I'm super excited about that investment, and I understand the bulk of that money is going to go into growers so they can try innovative production practices. As Fan Li said, the availability of cover crop seed and understanding what combinations and what species are best, hopefully that's going to play out as well.
Well, to answer your question, Cater, yeah, corn's doing an awful lot in this area. They're very interested for a couple of reasons. One is just the acreage, the sheer number of acres, but also the large root mass that the corn crop produces as well certainly has a lot of potential. But there's also, as you say, a lot of interest in the management side to try to preserve as much of that soil carbon as we can as well. But going now to the livestock side, I know there's a number of things, especially like in the dairy area, the beef area, perhaps poultry, on what's being done to avoid emissions, whether it's carbon or methane, perhaps, and what's facing your industry and what are the opportunities there.
Yeah, I would. Maybe this is a whole nother webinar topic for the future around sustainability and technology, genomics, and this is where I live every day. So, I mentioned cattle graze in 50 states, where the largest land use grazing is in the United States for agriculture, and the Northern Great Plains is a key focus area for NGOs that are concerned with carbon sequestration and species diversity, birds to butterflies to whatever. So the way you keep those working lands working is graze them, and that's that root mass through the Flint Hills of Kansas and the Sand Hills of Nebraska is a tremendous carbon sink. We don't get a lot of credit for that, but if you start plowing it up, you hear a lot of shouts, right? That holy smokes, what are y'all doing? It's WWF and Nature Conservancy and others would say it's North America's rainforest equivalent. So we, we're working on some of these issues every day. I would say the number one enemy of the beef industry from a sustainability perspective is an open cow, an idle animal that's not productive. So in the US, that means a cow that did not get bred that was expected to. So depending on when you pregnancy check her, she's remained in the herd eating feed and belching greenhouse gases and is unproductive except for maintaining her own body weight. So just to give you a little snippet of some of the things we look at when we think about sustainability. So again, from a genetics perspective, how do we understand those alleles that are causing embryo reabsorption or a lethal component in that embryo that's either causing a abortion or reabsorption of that embryo, and then you end up with an open cow. Because even worse would be you pregnancy check her pregnant and then she loses her calf, so she's staying with the herd until she was supposed to calve. So those are some those reproductive efficiencies are extremely important, but just thinking about it from a genetics perspective, and I know I'm rambling because this is a big riddle, and I would agree with what the crop side is already stating, that one of our key barriers to making positive changes on sustainability is this this tension between consumer acceptance of novel technologies and that tug of war between sustainable production. That's a difficult, and we've worked in that with consumer market research and that narrative, and you know, I'm talking to scientists, but go talk to the man on the street. I'm sure this audience has probably seen the Jimmy Kimmel Man on the Street GMO clip. I hope you all have. If not, please Google it and watch it. You know, it takes 20 people to come up with the right answer of what is a GMO. And that's about 10 or 15 years old now, but I don't think we have a more educated populace today around scientific issues. And so I think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, but I do feel like there's a lot of opportunity. The ability through, I'll just mention this since it came up in that regenerative deal. So every edible cover crop and or crop residue in the US, I would say 90% are being utilized today by ruminants, because if you look at that drought map, you know that forage is, or any kind of roughage, is at a premium. So those cows are grazing corn stalks. You know, I'm from the Southeast. We fly in ryegrass seed over the top of that cotton to create a winter grazing option to also stabilize the ground, but put some organic matter back with that dung pile and keep that deal going. So cattle are a key contributor to a sustainable system. And I would say we're just coming off the global conference on sustainable beef last week here in Denver. We hosted about 250 folks from around the world. And one of the key themes was sustainable intensification. The worst thing that can happen is for North America to reduce our beef production, because we do it more sustainably than anyone else in the world. And that production is going to shift because the demand is there. So I think those are some of the challenges that we need to look at.
So Janet, I don't know that much about the poultry industry and what their sustainability issues are, but I'd be interested to hear, either in terms of your carbon score or greenhouse gas side of things, what are some issues your industry has, especially as it relates to a genetic or environmental effect?
Well, Highline has selected for feed efficiency in birds for a long time. Actually, the whole industry has. And so the cost in terms of the amount of feed to produce a dozen eggs is much less than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. So that's a feed efficiency, which I think also becomes part of that sustainability. And I know somebody had done some calculations a few years ago. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but just showed with that increased efficiency how many less thousands, millions of acres of corn that needed to be grown to produce feed to feed the same number of birds, because they didn't need as much. They didn't need to eat as much because they were more efficient. They didn't waste as much. I suppose didn't have enough manure. I don't know if anybody's actually measured manure output, but it would make sense that there would be less manure for more efficient birds. One of the problems I have with sustainability is it's not always well defined, and it sort of differs from one conversation to the next. So to me, one of the issues that we have is this move away from cage into cage free. There's a lot of different studies that have shown I know this move is a consumer demand. Okay, people want to buy eggs. Well, some industries claim people want to buy eggs that are from cage-free birds, though. Sometimes if you have the option in the supermarket, they'll take the cheaper ones that are produced in the cage because you don't have the luxury to pay extra for the higher priced cage-free eggs. But one of the problems with this move to cage-free is it requires a lot more input, and it's a lot less efficient in terms of what you can get out. It costs more to produce eggs because the bird in the cage-free environment, because the bird eats more food. There's higher mortality. You get less saleable eggs out of that facility. So I think one of the other speakers were talking about what the people see as sustainable and what actually is sustainable. Cage-free is a big an issue related to efficiency and sustainability. If we could have some genetic understanding of the mechanisms, perhaps we can do something. As I mentioned earlier, we have this issue of moving from the elite lines to the commercial production facility and getting the changes moved. What genes do we need to manipulate? What do we need to do to make birds in cage-free conditions as efficient as the ones in the cage? And I think genetics would be the solution for that, certainly G/E anyway.
Yeah, Janet, that's a great illustration of that tension between technology and what the efficiencies tell us versus perceived consumer demand. But again, it's often maybe an NGO or activist driving some of this change, we all know. But I guess the other thing, you know, there's a lot of tension in this space around trade-offs when you get into sustainability. And I think that that's something we all have to remember. And what we're trying to do is look for areas where there's not a trade-off. Where are the win-win-win, you know, who can object to that cow staying bred and producing the calf if she's in the herd? I mean, there's not a whole lot of downside. And where do welfare, efficiency, and product quality, frankly, align? Things like this that benefit the consumer directly and have a positive welfare outcome. Those are the areas we're looking to align ourselves. So that's some food for thought.
Okay, I want to, before we run out of time, I want to make sure we get back to Chris's question about how does industry interact with academic researchers, because we have a number of them on the call. They'd probably be interested in hearing from you on how you interact, how you want to interact, are there internships available, and so forth, to further engage this interaction between our groups. So
David, maybe I can talk a little bit about that, because the ASTA actually has a lot of collaborations with our public sector universities. So ASTA, we do sponsor internships. So we've had a couple of ag students come through, and it's really interesting to see where kind of the science and policy intersect, and where sometimes science have to take a little bit of a backseat, unfortunately, for us scientists. I think too, the other thing is for us, like we have a seed course that we sponsor with Purdue University. We have UC Davis has their biotechnology and seed center where we do a lot of collaboration. One of the things that we found in the seed industry, and I don't know if this is in the animal side too, is we see like the education moving in a certain direction at public universities, and then we're losing out on like we don't have a pipeline, say, for plant pathologists, right? So we've been working with university to think about, from a seed industry's perspective, like what does our talent pipeline needs to look like, and how to support that at universities. We do a lot of pre-competitional kind of research collaboration with university, because aside from seed breeding, we need to move that seed across borders, and the phytosanitary, like the seed health certificate, is a huge issue for our industry. And that's across the board, regardless, how big your company is. We do a lot of collaboration on seed testing and that kind of work with universities. Cater, I don't know.
We have a foundation, National Cattlemen's Foundation, that sponsors a number of scholarships that are geared toward research. And then we award those scholarships in person at our national convention, which is 8,000 producers. So they have some exposure to producers when they attend our convention for sure. I guess the other piece would be, and I think I've already mentioned Meat Animal Research Center, and I believe most of our USDA facilities have producer engagement to sort of a feedback group. They call it Beef Focus Group, and they have them for each species they deal with up at the Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska. And then I mentioned also, most of the land grant universities that I've interacted with over the years have a producer feedback mechanism, and I think it's fairly healthy. Maybe a little stronger on extension than research, and maybe sometimes just collaborating within an institution with your extension brethren. As a researcher, you get a lot of feedback because those guys are out amongst producers every day. So that may be an easy feedback mechanism.
David, I'll real briefly mention from an ag research standpoint, we're funding, as I mentioned, about 300 university and USDA labs. Almost all that money goes into students. It's about $12 million. But an area that I haven't mentioned is we do have a probably even larger program of outreach on textile research. So we have a very strong program of training young professionals within the textile industry. We bring them into our headquarters, but we also have various workshops around the U.S. And we hire a fair number of interns in the textile research and textile design utilization. So we do have that huge opportunity for interns and educational within the textile spaces.
Any thoughts from the poultry industry?
I'll make a comment. I had indicated earlier that from my perspective, I saw a lot more USDA support of the beef and dairy genetics breeding industry than there is of the poultry. There are very few poultry research centers left. They've either been closed down or they've become small, that they're not nearly as productive or as useful as they were in the past. Very few facilities. The facilities are old. They don't reflect modern commercial production facilities. The broiler industry is much, much, much larger than the layer industry. And so there's a lot more funds available to support broiler research, not as much for layers. And over the last 20 plus years I've been at Highline, what I've been seeing at universities is that there's less and less basic poultry research being done there. Nutritionists, physiologists, when they've retired, they've been replaced with bioinformaticists or people for advanced tools, but not still understanding the basic bird. So it's becoming more and more difficult to get collaborations, to find universities that have the expertise to help answer certain questions.
All right. Well, once again, we've used up our allotted time, and very thoughtful comments from our panelists. We thank you, Janet, Josh, Cater, and Van Lee. The reason we do this is to make sure that the researchers doing the work to understand the relationship of genes and environment and phenotype understand the needs of our customers, which is you representing the industry and the farmers who are producing these crops and livestock. So, you know, it's very valuable to understand what your concerns are and where you need help from the researchers in this area. So again, a very hearty thanks and excellent job, panelists. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the invite and thanks for the work that you all
Okay.
did.
Thanks, David, and panel members. I want to also add my thanks to all of you, and also for David for moderating. Again, a very useful discussion. Couple of notes that you see on the screen here. So our field days are all every third Wednesday of the month. Next month, that would be December 21st, and so we decided that maybe that would not be a good time to have our next field day. So stay in touch. You'll get notices of when the next field day will be, but I was going to skip the December one. There is a workshop that is being organized this Friday. There's still opportunities to register. So that's on sharing unmanned aerial vehicles based high throughput plant phenotyping data via public clouds, which I think is also relevant for livestock. We also have generate large data sets nowadays through for phenotyping and need to manage those in some way. And then finally, there's a new round of seed grants. These will be larger scale seed grants, so that's why we call them coconut grants. All the information is available on the AG2PI website. They're due January 6th, and if you have any questions, just reach out to us. And then there's still some smaller grants, these rolling community event grants and working group grants that are available. And Nicole has just shared the RFP website for the coconut grant. So look at that. If you want to continue this conversation, there's a Slack channel that has been set up to continue that. And I think as you log off, I think you're also being asked to fill out a small survey, which we hope you do. So with that, I'm going to close things off. Thanks again to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.